The information in this program is provided as a service to our local community by the Fayette County Public Relations Initiative.
I'm Laura Kuhns. I'm the Executive Director of the Fay-Penn Economic Development Council, and I'm really pleased and proud to introduce our newly elected state representative, Charity Grimm-Krupa. Let me tell you, my experience in just knowing Charity in a short time is that we have elected a good person here in Fayette County to help carry us forward to a new era. And we are working and collaborating. And one of the first things we talked about were nonprofits. So I want to introduce Charity. Thank you for sponsoring this and have her tell you why she wanted to do this.
First of all, thank you. Thank you all for being here too, because it shows your commitment to serving the community, and our nonprofits are really the backbone of particularly low-income, underprivileged places like Fayette County. So your desire to learn more about nonprofits and move forward with a nonprofit speaks volumes of who you are and your character. I want to start though by thanking Laura and Fay-Penn. Honestly, and I've told her this before, I had no idea what Fay-Penn was all about, and I'm extremely impressed with the community outreach they're doing and the resources they're providing to, start up businesses, but economic development, and they are doing so much more than what appears on the surface. So huge thank you to them. It wouldn't be possible. I told Laura and staff my ideas, and they ran with it. So your brochure says I'm a presenter. I'm a glorified host. So they've done the lion's share of the work, but I really want to thank them for that, for this event and everything else that they're doing to help me, help you, and also for the community. If you haven't gotten your packet with the slideshow and room for notes, raise your hand and Dawn will get you one. Also, it's really important that you do the media release form just because it is being recorded today. So if you need one of those forms, raise your hand and Dawn will give you one. And then Dawn can either collect those later or you can drop them off as we move around a little bit later on in the day. I do want to mention where the idea for this event came from briefly. So I'm an attorney from Fayette County who's practiced in Fayette County, small town America, and you can only do so much in terms of expertise. And over the years, I would occasionally, it seemed maybe every year or so, I would get a call from somebody, oftentimes it was somebody that I knew personally, and they'd say, hey, I've got this idea for a nonprofit, and I don't know where to start. And embarrassing as it was, as an attorney who has no expertise in that area, I didn't even know who to refer them to. I'm not aware of, and I could be wrong, but I'm not aware of any specific attorney in Fayette County that really has nonprofits as their specialty or their expertise. And I think it's important that the people in our area in southwestern Pennsylvania know where to start, know what the regulations are and the compliance issues, because that tax-exempt nonprofit status is something extremely special and important and valuable. So not only do we want to help you get your nonprofit off the ground, we want to make sure that you're being compliant so you can reap all the rewards of that nonprofit status. So with that, we have an excellent board of presenters today. They are all experts in what they do, and I look forward personally to learning more about nonprofits. So thank you all for being here.
Great. So I'm just going to briefly go over the agenda. Welcome. Come on in. We're just starting with the agenda. Just so y'all know, we're actually, you're sitting in our Business Events Center, which is an FMB sponsorship, and we have all kinds of events here, and I want to make you aware that it is available for free for businesses, but also nonprofits. So if you do end up developing your nonprofits, this is a nice resource and facility for you to have a meeting. You coordinate with Sandy McClellan, we call Sandy our Siri. She does everything, and she keeps the schedule. So there are a lot of events here. I wanted to mention that. You have an agenda with the program, and Charity, you really did do a lot, because what you did was the outline of the program that you thought needed to be addressed, and it was absolutely perfect. It covered all the topics. So we have developed the speakers and the panels based on that. So I'm just going to briefly let you know, for the first half of this, we're going to be here in the BEC. And we're going to have two separate presentations from Peter Woke, who I will introduce in a moment. Then at about 11:30, we're going to take a 10-minute break so you can, check phones, go to the bathroom, whatever. Then we're going to go downstairs, or upstairs, sorry, I'm turned around, Sandy, to our launch box, which is an incubator for small business that we partner with Penn State Fayette. And again, I would like to say that all these things are available to nonprofits as well as small business. We don't focus just on small business. I think Charity raised a great point. A lot of the things that go on in Fayette County are supported by nonprofits, and we are employers too. We have our great Fay Penn team sitting here in the back. So anyway, nonprofits are an important driver in economic development. They provide a lot of support services, but we also create jobs. So with that, when we do that, we're going to have our internal Fay Penn team, and I have our kind of nonprofit specialists, those of us on the staff who've worked the most with nonprofits, will have kind of an informal presentation, which Susan McCarthy, our PR and marketing partner, will lead that off. And then we're going to break for lunch. And then after that, we'll have a specialist come, Rob DiOrio, who's going to talk about funding your nonprofit and how you get grants, what kind of grants. So we want this to be a resource, and we want you to feel free to, be interactive, ask questions, follow up later after the event. We have business cards here so you can get our emails. But with that, I want to introduce Peter Woke, who is going to speak in 2 sessions. The first will be an introduction to nonprofits, talking about what is a nonprofit, pros and cons of a nonprofit versus for-profit. Then Peter will talk about how you launch a nonprofit, how you define your mission, create your brand, all those things, all the nuts and bolts that go into it from a legal perspective. I am pleased to introduce Peter. I have worked with Peter for nearly 20 years. He is an amazing nonprofit specialist. He's a resource, and he has a lot of experience dealing with nonprofits. He actually had his master's in education from Harvard in nonprofit administration, planning, and social policy, and graduated with honors from American University Law School, where he now teaches nonprofit law and governance. He's also taught nonprofit law for the DC Bar for the last 20 years, and has written The Art of Creating Nonprofit Organizations, How to Develop Self-Sustaining Nonprofit Organizations, and The Paper Chase, Nonprofit Filings, Forms, and Record Keeping. So Peter has been an amazing resource to me throughout my career in nonprofits. I've managed several, run several. Happy to be here with Fay Penn as we're kind of working with Fayette County on, again, revitalizing the area. So with that, Peter, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Charity. Good morning, everybody. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah, good. Let me know if there's anybody who can't. Well, what a great way to start the day, listening to a lawyer, right? Isn't that what we always want to do? I'm going to try to make this not only informative, but I hope enjoyable in the sense that it brings down to your level an understanding of how you set up a nonprofit, and also with some anecdotes, I think that will help me describe the points I'd like to describe for you. So Tracy has the slides. If we can go ahead, put up, and I think we're just past, if we can get to the introduction, that'd be great. Good. Okay. So part 1 introduction. Are you there? Yeah. Thank you. Good. Well, I want to outline for you the laws that apply, and then get into the structures, governance, how you set it up, restrictions, opportunities, all the way through to operations. So that's the goal I have for this morning with you. There'll be plenty of time for questions. I'd welcome them, and I'll see what I can do to help. You will also see in the slides and in my comments, I've entered practice tips for you. I'm trying to give you resources so at the end of today, you will have the opportunity to go use, avail yourselves of these other community or statewide resources to help you if you want to go ahead and pursue formation of a nonprofit. So I've included those, and of course we can discuss those later this morning as well. So let's go ahead and jump in. One of the things you would want to know is the hierarchy of legal authority. So some of these don't directly apply in a day-to-day sense, but let's look. We're always governed by the U.S. Constitution and statutes, then the state constitution and statutes. The next one down that applies that's important to us is the tax exemption application. We'll be talking a bit about that. Then we have articles of incorporation, bylaws, and policies. Every nonprofit will have all of those last 4. An application, articles, bylaws, and policies. I would say They will focus on the articles first, but that's the essential structure and hierarchy of the documents that apply to nonprofits. Okay, Tracy, let's go ahead. So what is a nonprofit organization? Well, essentially, it's a group set up to improve the community. That's what it's all about. And there are many different forms of nonprofits. The most prominent and frequent are the ones listed, 501c3, which is probably mostly what you all might be interested in. And those are the charitable, educational, scientific, religious, testing for public safety, prevention of cruelty to animals, child welfare, those kinds of groups. That's the biggest group. And that's mostly, I think, what you might be thinking about. In fact, maybe just by a show of hands, does that kind of fall into what you all are thinking? If you could raise your hand if you're thinking about those. Yeah, good. Anybody outside of that? I want to make sure. I think that might cover the general interest. You will also hear about frequently 501c4s. Those are social welfare groups, and 501c6 trade associations. But this morning, let's focus on the 501c3s. Okay, so next, please. But before we get to the decision, or en route to the decision about setting up as a 501c3, I want you to know a few characteristics about nonprofits. First of all, they're different from for-profits. So if I have somebody come to me and say, I have $1 million idea, I want to set up a nonprofit, I'll say, that's great. But guess what? If you put the $1 million idea into the nonprofit will own it and you won't. And that's okay if that's what you want, but I want you to know that. Also, when you put any effort into the nonprofit, you generally expect you will have that nonprofit under your control forever. But that also is not true. Nonprofits are not about personal control. You remain in a position as a director, that's what they're called, or trustee, for as long as you're elected. And you're either elected by other directors, if that's your structure, or by voting members, if you have those folks. I'm getting a little bit ahead, but I want to give you previews of upcoming points. So let's look at our list here. A for-profit, you can own the corporation. You own the ideas and the assets that you put into it. You can keep the profits, and you can control it for as long as you want to have it. So that's the threshold, as we say, the initial question about when you're setting something up. Is that really what you're about? Which is totally great. You know, our communities and country operate on the initiatives of for-profit corporations as well. If you want a nonprofit, you just would want to know that no one owns the nonprofit organization. The nonprofit owns any assets it gets. It keeps its profits. It doesn't distribute them to individuals. And you don't get to control it. You are, as I said, a director for as long as you are elected or reelected. So that's kind of the initial question. I would say most people in my experience who want to set up a nonprofit aren't expecting what is on the left side. Otherwise, they wouldn't be pursuing it. But I want to make sure you've considered it as you go in with the ideas you might have in mind. Okay, let's progress to the practice tips I see there. All right, so there's some kind of next steps that you might want to take as you get more specific about setting up your group. So before you decide on a name, you want to make sure it's available in Pennsylvania. And I've given you the URL that will tell you what you cannot do is use a name that's already in use or already reserved. So before you put time, effort, and some, dedication into a name, you want to make sure you'd be able to use it. That's an early item for you to get to. If you like a name, but you're not ready to file, you can file a name reservation. So you can hold a name that you are expecting to use. And if you want to take a further look, let's say your group, let's start with a local group. Maybe you want to be a group that focuses on literacy or feeding, clothing and housing the homeless. You would be a local group. Probably looking at just the Pennsylvania available names would be enough. But if you wanted to be a national group, you might want to look at the IRS listing so that you don't get confused to be or with a group with a similar or identical name. And I've given you the URL for that. Okay.
Question.
Go ahead. Yeah.
If you were an international nonprofit, is there an avenue that you have to follow to make sure that no one else has this name as well, or does that not apply?
Well, that's a great question. It's not an easy check, but here's a suggestion as to what you might want to do. You can go to the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office database. It's called uspto.gov. uspto.gov. You follow the links to trademarks. You can search trademarks. Now, that's not to get you, I'll tell you what it will get you, what it won't. What that will get you is a listing of whether there is a name already trademarked so that it's not available for use in the US for whatever your purpose is. Now, this is a sort of a sidebar on trademark law. And let me just maybe a couple of quick things. Trademarks are protected in classes. So you can have a trademark that's the same, United Airlines and United Van Lines. Those are two different classes. So if you do this, you would want to look to see if there is a group with the same name doing the same types of things, in the same class. It might take some kind of thinking about what is coming up. But that will tell you who has the right to use it in the US. It does not tell you if it is clear internationally, but as sort of a practical matter or a business matter, you will have information about whether you would get the right to use it in the US. And that's a pretty big market. So in other words, if someone wants to have international reach, they usually want to have international reach into the US. So you're not getting it for the world, but you're getting it for one of the best markets in the world. So essentially, you have an operational leg up. Okay, does that all make sense? Good. Okay. Actually, I'll just tell you this. I am a scout leader, and a long time ago, we realized that we're on hikes with scouts. If we ask them if everybody's ready, we never get everybody's response. But if we ask, is anybody not ready to hike, we get a response. So, okay. Is anybody not ready to move to the next point? Good, we're good to go. All right, I wanted to make sure that was clear, but succinct on trademarks. Okay, to your question. All right, so that's kind of the beginning. That's the introduction to this. Let's talk about launching the group. So launching the nonprofit. You have a choice when you're setting up a nonprofit. You can set it up in corporate form, you can incorporate it, or you can not incorporate it. And there's a big difference in what that gets you. If you're an unincorporated nonprofit, you lack the protection of a corporate, it's called a shell, of a corporate shell around you. So you can be an unincorporated entity, but that subjects directors and if you have members to potential liability. Now, some states provide limited protection even for unincorporated nonprofits, but most don't. So you would run the risk if you're having programs in other states or people from other states or participants that you would have people who could make a claim against the individuals, you all inside an unincorporated entity. That's why most businesses and most nonprofits create some sort of protective form. The most common and the longest standing protective form, and the one that applies to nonprofits, is corporate form. There is a limited opportunity for LLCs, limited liability companies, for nonprofits, but not for this type of creation. It gets into something more technical. LLCs, if you've heard of those, can be used for-profits. but they're not a sensible option for nonprofits. Not when you're creating. Again, there's a technical area where it can work. So when you're creating your group, your first question about formation is, do you want it to be a corporation or do you want it to be unincorporated? And I think you generally want it to be in corporate form, so you'll have that initial shell or initial layer of liability protection. Okay. All right. So let's go ahead to the next point. So with tax exempt nonprofit status, the organization doesn't pay taxes. So we're still comparing it to for-profits in a way, but just so you know what the advantages are. Specifically to 501c3s, which I thought, as it seems to be the case, that's your main interest. 501c3s have access to individual, corporate, and foundation donated funds. In other words, we know that if we make a donation to a 501c3, we can take a charitable deduction. Also, there are foundations that are 501c3s. They're called, technically, they're called private foundations. And they are obligated to give their funds to other 501c3s that are funded by the general public. So it's a system that is set up to help support 501c3s, like the type I think you might have in mind once they qualify. So it is a pipeline of support that you might want to, well, I think definitely want to understand as an advantage when you're creating an entity. Again, if it fits into your overall thoughts as a nonprofit and as specifically as a C3.
So Peter, C3s are the only entity, nonprofit under the tax code that can offer the tax deduction for donation, correct?
C3 are the only that can offer it for charitable deductions. Yes.
Yes.
Yes. It's
I think that's
possible.
important. Yeah, for people listening, because if they're thinking about these others, they need to know that that really is the only entity that could get many grants from the government, right? You can't get government grants for other entities. So just something.
Right. There are grants and contracts and opportunities set aside just for 501c3s. And although on a separate area of the tax code, people can make donations as business deductions, that is the advantage to the C3s is the charitable deduction. Yes. So that's right. Yeah, business deductions do apply and they are also a tax benefit. But here, this is the reserved to 501c3s. That's exactly right. And also C3s inherently have more credibility because, again, the focus is on helping the community, not enriching individuals. So that is supposed to be a key characteristic. You might be a 501c3 that offers its expertise in different areas or your area of endeavor. And that creates credibility. Credibility creates trust, which can help create interest in financial support for your organization. Okay, so let's look at the steps of creating the entity. I think we've decided we want it to be in corporate form. So what we do is we create and file articles of incorporation. These are this is the document that outlines the purposes of your organization. Let's pause for a second here. Articles of incorporation for a for-profit don't have to be specific. All they have to do is say that a for-profit corporation is set up for lawful purposes or to conduct lawful business. Articles of incorporation are a public document too. So if you wanted to see, for example, the articles of incorporation for Amazon or Google, probably they're filed in Delaware just because for-profits have an advantage, but you could do that. You could see it. And theoretically, I haven't looked, but theoretically, the articles of incorporation for Amazon might look the same as the articles of incorporation for a corner gas station that's incorporated, just set up for lawful purposes. Nonprofits is a totally different story. Nonprofits, there have to be restrictions put into the articles of incorporation in order to allow that entity to qualify for tax-exempt status. So when you are setting up your organization, you want it to be limited to the charitable purposes, charitable, educational, religious, that whole list, but the ones that would apply to your group. And those go into the articles of incorporation. Well, we'll talk a little bit more in specifically about articles, but I want you to understand there is a reason for specificity in the articles of nonprofits. The next corporate step is you create bylaws, and bylaws are what outlines the procedures. Essentially, bylaws allocate power in your organization. Who gets to vote on what? How do they meet? How many people have to meet? How much notice do they get? How are you set up in subsets like committees? Do you have officers? You will have officers. What do the officers do? It's how the organization runs and the power that each entity has within it, or the overall entity has to exercise. I'll tell you a quick story about bylaws. Actually, a legal case. There was a case in Virginia where these directors were re-electing themselves to the board, but they decided not to re-elect 2 directors they didn't want to have continue. And those 2 directors were upset. They were mortified, they were embarrassed, and unfortunately, they were the only ones who read the bylaws. So they brought a lawsuit saying, you haven't conducted the director elections properly. And the judge in Virginia invalidated 10 years worth of board of directors, saying the last valid board of directors he could identify was 10 years prior, and invalidated all those decisions. Why? Simply because they didn't follow their bylaws. So I make a point about this because bylaws are easy to change. You can change them virtually at every meeting or any meeting where you've given notice of the changes. But what you want to do is make sure you comply. Another one real quick. I used to work at the University of Vermont. This is after my master's program and before law school. I helped to run a nonprofit on campus. And the discussion then was, when they're building a new building, when do they build the sidewalk? You have an existing building, you're building a new building. When do you build the sidewalk? Well, some people said, just you decide where you want to build it, and that's where you put it in. That's where you put in the sidewalk. Other people said, actually, you wait, you build the new building, you look to see where the students walk, and then you build the sidewalk under where they walk, where they walk. So why am I mentioning this? I'm mentioning it because you want to make sure when you're doing your bylaws that you walk where your bylaws tell you to. And if they do not, you change the bylaws or you change where you're walking. This is so important because most of the infractions I've seen in a governance sense have been failure to follow bylaws. Now, I know you haven't created yours perhaps, but I just want that to be a part of your understanding, an important part of your understanding. All right. The third corporate step after incorporation, you elect the officers, authorize actions, including adopting the bylaws that activate the organization. Okay, let's go ahead. So what would the organization look like in terms of governance structure? You'll have a board of directors, and sometimes they're called board of trustees. You can call them just about anything. I think board of directors is probably the most understandable. You'll have officers. You might have board committees, probably will, depending on how big your board is, so that you don't have to convene the whole group all the time. FAPEN certainly has that. You might have an executive committee. An executive committee is a microcosm of the board that's set up to make decisions of the board in between meetings. That helps to save time, but they want to just do the things the board would do anyhow, not make different decisions than the board would if it convened. You can have advisory boards. We'll talk to you a little bit more about that as well. And hopefully you'll have paid or at least volunteer staff. So that's the structure we have for nonprofit governance. Okay, let's go ahead now deeper into those documents. Articles of incorporation. As I said, these identify the purposes of your group, and you have to be specific. And if you want to be a C3, it has to fall within those purposes. They're used to identify the initial directors, and articles are used to indicate if the organization will have members and if they will have voting rights. So members and directors are two different things. Every organization, every corporation has directors. You can decide how many you want to have. You generally need to have more than three or more, but you don't have to have members. Members are folks that pay dues and belong to an organization. So Fay Penn is set up, it has members because that's aligned with its structure and purpose. A lot of C3s don't have members. It just is not how they're set up. Like the Red Cross. Red Cross is a 501c3. It doesn't have members, has a lot of supporters, but no one belongs to it in that sense. So you will think about this in your structuring. I want to just prompt you to think about different ways or characteristics you'll have for your groups. So the next document is the bylaws. As I said, the bylaws are the rules by which power is allocated, decisions are made. So in there, you'll put the number and qualifications of your directors. You might have specific qualifications, expertise, or some other things that you want from your directors. Your officer positions, typically it's, president, vice president, secretary, treasurer, or chair, vice chair. You can designate as you wish. You include meeting times and how much notice people get of your meetings. Quorum, that's the minimum number you have to have at a meeting to make it a valid meeting. Committees, you'd identify if you have them. If you have members, their classes, their qualifications, meetings, notice, voting, and the process for changing the bylaws. So that's a sort of a skeletal outline of what bylaws would contain. And let's get to, well, this seems a little overwhelming. Let's get to another practice tip. So first of all, your articles of incorporation, once you're ready, they can be filed online, and that's the URL there. But all of this can be quite a bit challenging. And I think, as Charity said, you want to be able to have a resource to help you, and they're not always readily found. I think this is a good resource. It's called PANO, the Pennsylvania Association of Nonprofit Organizations. I've given you the URL of that group. That group is set up to, among other things, help nonprofits get created and going. So that's a terrific resource for you to keep in mind. Okay. All right, let's look ahead a little further. Mission and vision statements. So I want to mention these to you. Mission and vision statements don't have legal significance, but quite often this is how you describe your entity's efforts to your board, to workers, to the community. You'll say, this is what we do. So there are different definitions. I've kept these very succinct, but I want to make sure we have the concepts. You can make them longer, and I've seen different definitions. But essentially, a mission statement describes what your organization does. The vision statement explains the impact if you fulfill your mission. So, for example, one mission statement might be to help feed and clothe disadvantaged people in the county. And your vision statement might be everybody in the county having sufficient food, water, and shelter. That's your vision. That's what happens if you are successful. These are very useful tools, I think, in helping you guide, explain, govern, and promote your organization. They don't have legal significance. They don't enter into a legal document, but they are a manifestation of what it is you want to do. Okay, makes sense? All right, so that's the focus on the corporate steps. Now let's talk about creating the entity, the tax steps. Once you're incorporated under the corporate steps, you have your articles filed and approved. You have created bylaws. You've had a meeting where you have essentially activated the entity, adopted the bylaws, elected your officers, and taken other steps. Then you get into the tax steps. The first step there is to file what's called Form SS4, and it's an online process. You file it to obtain an employer ID number. It's called an EIN. that essentially is a social security number for your group. It helps distinguish your group from other groups so you don't get mistaken with groups that have tax problems, and so that you can use your identity when people are making donations and things. You also use that, as we use our social security numbers, you use that on the report that goes to the IRS, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. So that's the first step. It is an online form. The next step, and this is probably the most challenging in the process, is filing Form 1023, the tax exemption application. All right. So for the groups, actually, let's go to the next slide. We'll talk about that, and then I'll talk about the differences. So the whole idea with this is that you're asking the IRS to look at your group and determine if it is going to be qualified as a 501c3. So the application is used. It's fairly long. The full application is fairly long, and it has a lot of schedules because some groups do things that other groups don't. Let's just talk for a minute about that. For every group, there is a section on the 1023 that you complete that talks about or asks you about what are your purposes and activities. What are you going to do? What is it going to look like? You're going to conduct seminars. You're going to operate a soup kitchen. You're going to rescue animals in need. Whatever it is you're going to do, they want to know specifics about that. Okay. In the process of the life of your organization, you will review your activities periodically, organizational activities. And if you add any, you will make a note of that on your tax return. But otherwise, the Form 1023 establishes the scope of the activities you can conduct. Now, here's a key point about the 1023, and that's you don't have to do everything that you put into the 1023. You might put a lot of things in that you hope to do, plan to do, but you're just starting. You might not know. But everything that you put into your 1023 that gets approved is considered to be approved by the IRS. So if you ever activate that endeavor, pursue that activity, you can get revenue, you can get paid. People, whatever, attending seminars or maybe paying to become bilingual or whatever that is, then that becomes related income. I'm jumping ahead, I'll get to more specifics, but it's a great strategy for you to think broadly about what you might do, what you could ever want to do when you're doing your tax exemption application. Okay, does anybody have questions about that? I'll talk to you a little bit more, but okay, so that's one. Oh, good. Was someone asking? Oh, to say that's one where you really want to be as specific as you can. Now, for the smallest groups, there is what's called a 1023 EZ. EZ. That's a lot easier to use, and those are for groups with the smallest level of anticipated income for the first 3 years. So if you're going to be, and this is all sort of on kind of an honor system, if you believe you're going to be a small group in terms of your income, you can use the 1023 EZ, and that's a lot easier to do. So yeah.
A threshold for, say, filing the EZ now and then later on having to file the long form?
The threshold is $50,000. So if you anticipate your group will have as gross receipts, money from everywhere and anywhere and any source, in the each of the first 3 years, less than $50,000, you can file it. Now, you don't know, maybe you'll hit a bonanza and get great funding, but it is a good faith statement on this application, you'll always sign IRS forms under penalty of perjury. So it's not that you need to know. If you get a lot of money and you're surprised by it, that's fair enough. But if you know, or if you've already gotten it, you don't want to file it with an inaccurate statement. But $50,000 in each of the first 3 years, that will make it a lot easier to pursue your status if you qualify. You don't have to go back to do the 1023 normally if you have more, but if you have a lot more, the IRS might ask questions and might say, yeah, tell us a little bit more about your organization. However, if you're just in good faith anticipating 50,000 or less in each of your first 3 years, then you would qualify. Now, remember, if you're planning to have employees and conduct activities, 50,000 doesn't go far. So you might, especially by your 3rd year, think there's no way I could just limit it to 50,000. I would need more than that. Okay.
At that point, is that when we have to change our form to the long form?
Only if the IRS asks you to. In other words, if you've already been granted, that's right. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So we're still on the tax exemption applications. Go back one, please. Yeah. Good. So the tax exemption application, it can be amended if you come up with an idea for an activity that you didn't put in originally. Now, the way you amend it is you make a note on your tax return, the 990. But let's say you're a group to, again, operate a soup kitchen, and you realize, you know what, we really want to also do bilingual education. Well, that's not what you're set up to do normally or already. So you go back to your articles of incorporation. If they don't authorize it, you amend your articles. That's your foundation. Then you use your 990, that's the tax return, and you say, hey, IRS, we're also doing this other activity. And you disclose it. And if the IRS has questions, they will ask it. As long as it's within a C3 purpose, they might ask you, they might not, but you need to disclose it, and you can continue pursuing it. And the IRS has a certain amount of time to get back to you if it has questions. The 1023 application has to be disclosed on request. And what goes into the 1023 application includes not just the 1023, but your articles and your bylaws. So if anybody wants to see your articles and bylaws and your application, you have to disclose it. But here's an additional practice tip. If there is a 501c3 that exists already that's similar to what you do, they have to disclose it to you. So if you know there's another group doing what you want to do, you can contact them and say, hey, would you send me your tax exemption application, articles, and bylaws? And by law, they have to, just as you would have to. They can charge you a minimal amount for photocopying, but they have to provide that as you would have to. So that's something you might want to note as well. Okay, yeah, let's go ahead. So in the next practice tip, there is an IRS publication that is essentially a mini encyclopedia. It's called Publication 557. It is an extremely useful resource, not so much easy or fun to read, but a really good resource. It allows you to understand each type of tax status. We'd focus on C3s. So it gives some pages just on C3s. It also gives sample articles of incorporation just for you to see. And that can help you. So that's another good resource I'd like you to be aware of. Okay, let's go ahead. So we've covered, just so you know, the part one is the introduction and deciding on form. Part two is launching it, how we set it up, articles, bylaws, structures, and the application. Now we're getting to part three, running the nonprofit. Okay, so there are legal duties that apply to nonprofit directors. And I've given you a summary here. I'll just describe them a little bit. The first is this duty of care. Nonprofit directors, and I sit on boards too. I sit on boards. I don't sit on any boards that I counsel. I think that's an irreconcilable conflict to be counselor and counselee, but I do sit on nonprofit boards. as just a director. So when we do that, we have to engage in prudent management. Now, what is prudence? Well, prudence is really kind of knowing what's going on. You come to a board meeting, you really need to know, what are we voting on and what position do I have, or do I need more information? Now, the key case in this area, which is still an important case, was one of the first ones decided. What does it mean? How much effort does a director have to put in for duty of care? And that was a case in which directors received reports that they didn't read, were on committees that didn't meet, and were directors of a nonprofit that financially led to failure. And then there were lawsuits. So the judge had to decide, well, what should directors of nonprofit C3s have to do? Now, this was a DC case, but it's used throughout, including Pennsylvania. And that is that directors have to engage in at least cursory supervision, at least that. In other words, enough so you know what's going on. It doesn't mean you or the other directors are going to read every report, that or every line, but you need to know enough so that you can vote and ask questions sensibly to help protect the organization. That really is what puts the obligation on staff to inform the directors. So Laura, Tracy, and the fellow staff work hard to make sure the directors get information so they have enough to make these decisions to fulfill their duty of care. All right. The second is duty of loyalty, and that gets into conflicts and corporate opportunities. We're going to do conflicts in a little while, but let's talk about corporate opportunities. That's not so much known. When you're sitting in a board meeting and an idea comes up, that idea is owned by the nonprofit. When you're in a board meeting, you're in a privileged setting. So, for example, if I'm legal counsel to Fay Penn, when Fay Penn has its board meetings, I don't have a right to be there. I'm there because I'm invited. The only people who have the right to be there are the board members, and they have both the right and the obligation. Now, they want expertise, they have questions, they want guidance, but it's their meeting, and it's a privileged setting. So if you think about it that way, everything that's said in a privileged setting is confidential unless you're told otherwise. And lots of times you're told otherwise, like, oh, we're going to have this event coming up in November. Go tell everybody. Well, obviously that's not confidential. It's the opposite. You want it publicized. But corporate opportunities are these ideas that come up in board meetings that are owned by the group. Oh, maybe a fundraising idea or an event along with your mission that you want to conduct next year. Pet adoption, if you're, helping to protect animals, a special kind of event. And you can't take that idea for your own use or for another nonprofit's use unless it's released by the group that came up with the idea. So that's really important, because if you have directors who think that the ideas are going to be stolen, used outside of the board, those directors will not share their best thinking. So I'm trying to give you a preview of how cueing the directors under this fiduciary duty as to why we have the duty. We want to make sure that people will come up with their best ideas and know that they will be treated with respect as owned by that group. You don't have the right to do that, or we as directors, we wouldn't have the right to take an idea that's been brought up any more than we'd be able to take computers home at the end of the board meeting. Hey, it was a great board meeting. I'm just going to take some of these computers owned by the organization, take them home with me. You can't. Both of those are owned. One's owned by idea, intellectual property. The other is owned as an asset, personal property. Okay, that's duty of loyalty. Duty of obedience, that's essentially that we're all going to work together to fulfill the rules and the governance obligations. Okay. In addition to these three, there is a federal law I want you to know about. And you can jot it down. It's called the Intermediate Sanctions Law. It's that reference at the bottom. No special benefit to insiders. Intermediate sanctions. This gets to kind of a sophisticated level, but I want to throw everything at you, and then you'll have it if you need it. Under this law, you can't give excess benefits to insiders. So you can't say, oh, my friend's on the board, I'll hire her, pay her more than I'd have to pay someone else because I like her, and let her do certain work. That would be an excess special benefit to an insider. You can't do that. So whenever it doesn't mean you can't do business with a director, but whenever you're doing business with a director, who might give you the best deal, by the way, you always have to have impartial people make the decision and comparison shop, like how much should that good or service cost, and then document how you've made your decision. That's what protects you. So along with these fiduciary duties, a specific federal law on how you operate if you're going to engage directors in a paid manner, not as directors, just doing other things. Okay. All right, let's move on. So what do board members do? We put together the organization. We have some restrictions, obligations. So, or board members, you want to choose them for their expertise. They bring credibility to your group. They support the mission and programs. You want them to stay informed, do committee work, vote, whatever the organizational interest is, act and communicate respectfully. I've seen a lot of boards go through problems because people aren't respectful in their communication. It's okay to disagree. It's good to disagree. It's good to air out differences, but one quick way to a breakdown in board interaction is for there to be disrespectful communication. You want board members who will attract participants, attract support the programs, and commit their expertise, again, to problem solving, not to process. I've seen that as well, where people get into all sorts of objections and technicalities and Robert's rules, which you can choose if you like, but for small groups, you want to focus on problem solving, I think. All right, let's go on to what board members don't do. So there are certain things, and as your organization grows, and true for any group, there are things that the staff do and things that directors do, and they are different. Sometimes it initiates on one side of the column, sometimes on the other. So let's take a look. Generally, staff will develop a budget. Laura, Tracy, all the staff, FAPEN staff, they develop the budget. The board approves it. The board approves activities. The staff implements. The staff prepares financial statements. The board oversees those. Staff help conduct day-to-day activities. The board will oversee the impacted activities. The staff advises board on policy. The board finalizes and develops a policy. And finally, the board oversees organizational health. So this might be something that comes up more down the line with you, but you want to make sure that things stay in their correct columns. You don't want board members telling staff what to do in their activities because they don't supervise the staff. They oversee the organization. So certain things that board members do separate from what staff do.
Question. When you're you have a very limited number of people, how do you recommend any kind of pickups or conflicts by wearing multiple hats?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think let's look at the next slide. Oh, you already, there it is. Okay, so this is what everybody would do as staff. And so you might have a board member who is also the executive director. So you have that. So when you're doing staff, you're conducting, overseeing the activities, implementing mission, vision, developing ideas, hiring and training other staff. These are all the things: reporting finances, providing information, coordinating with the board chair. That's usually the CEO or executive director, implementing the programs, developing the budget. And this is really important. Setting up the CEO, or that's the same, or executive director, as the spokesperson. So I think when you're talking about multiple hats, think of those as the staff responsibilities. And then you can go back to the other one. Now, it's just important for people to stay in their lane, especially as the staff grow. But yeah, you might be the board chair, and the next day be stuffing envelopes the way staff member would. So it's not so much that you can't do it, it's that you want to make sure you're not telling people what to do in a role that you don't occupy, and you don't want to take on authority that you really don't have if you're in a different situation. So when the board chair comes in, let's say the board chair came in and helped the FAPEN staff stuff envelopes. He would be probably the lowest level staff member that day at FAPEN. He would not be the board chair. He'd be just a low. So he couldn't be saying, hey, this is how I want to do it. That's nice. You're just a volunteer. You're the lowest, essentially, on the hierarchy. So if you can maybe think of a dynamics that way and use this as the listing of what staff might do, that I think could help.
That was very.
Okay, no, good. I'm glad. The board chair responsibilities, I'm going to let that as a list for you. I want to make sure we pick up some more time. I see a typo actually, but so that's what the board chair does. Essentially, they are the connecting point back down to the organization's executive director or CEO. Let's go next. And we can go back if you have questions on any of these. Role and benefits of advisory board members. There are some people you might want to have help the organization, but you don't want them on the board. Or they might not want to be on the board, or they might not have time to be on the board. This is where you have a resource called an advisory board member. And you can bring them on to maybe help with fundraising or help with structuring or help with strategic planning, but they wouldn't necessarily be a director. They wouldn't be on the voting part of the board. They wouldn't have those obligations. They wouldn't come to all the meetings. They have a limited role as providing essentially advice and guidance. So that's a tool I wanted to make sure is on your radar. Okay, let's go to the next. I told you we'd get to this, and that's conflicts of interest. And it is part of handling the duty of loyalty. There are lots of definitions and lots longer ones. I always prefer things succinct when I'm teaching. So this is how I want to convey the concepts. A conflict of interest is any impediment to being impartial and loyal to the group. There are very few absolutes in life, but this is an absolute. You always disclose it. If you have a conflict, say the organization's setting up a website and your cousin is bidding on it, you always disclose. By the way, one of the bidders is my cousin. You always disclose it. And then the remaining board members, the ones who don't have a conflict, they're impartial, they decide whether you can be there for the discussion and the vote. And my general guidance is there's no benefit to you being there for the discussion or vote. It's much easier to justify a decision later to say, yeah, she had the conflict, she was out of the room, we discussed and we voted. And you put that into the minutes that the person was excused. That way people can help build more trust and reliance on your decisions. Okay.
Another question.
Please.
Is this an implied rule, or is it something that because the board of directors should know some of these things, or is it something that is recommended to have written up and signed and agreed upon?
Oh, okay. Yeah. First of all, it's required. It's required by the IRS, and you will you can create the policy with whatever additional procedures you want, but you have to have one, and even if you didn't have to, you want to. And then each year on your 990, that's the report, you would disclose whether you have one or not and whether you're enforcing it. This is a big deal to the IRS.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Peter, I'm on some boards where they really redo, the organization redoes that every year. Like, it's a good idea to update your conflict of interest statements and policies and get ethics disclosures. You need to have all that like in your files.
Okay.
In case the IRS ever looks, we'll talk later about IRS audits, not a fun topic. We'll talk about that after lunch.
Okay. Good. Okay. Good. Let's go on to the next. And this is an important concept. And let me just tell you, this is how I describe it. So when I was growing up, and I'm older than a bunch of you there, I grew up watching the Superman TV show, but is there anybody who doesn't know who Superman is? Okay, we all know who Superman is. All right. Well, the Superman episodes I watched almost always ended the same way. Do we know the characters, Jimmy and Lois, right? They always ended with Jimmy and Lois being held at gunpoint by some bad guy. And it was always a dark and stormy night, and the windows would blow open. And just when the bad guy was shooting his gun, Superman would land right in front of Jimmy and Lois, and the bullets would bounce off his chest. Right? Do you remember that, or can you picture that? Okay. Superman was probably a pretty smart guy, but he didn't know. Actually, that was indemnification. So Superman was standing between the harm that would occur and the people who might be harmed. So indemnification is the same thing. If someone sues your group and your directors, indemnifying them is standing between the harm, the lawsuit and claims, and in front of your directors to protect them. You want to indemnify under Pennsylvania law. In certain cases, you have to indemnify. Now, this is a whole other area, but I want you to get the concepts first. And that is to indemnify. In other words, people sue people for all different reasons and sometimes unsupported reasons. But if you get sued, you have to respond. Otherwise, you could lose the case just on a default judgment. That's just how things are. So if there ever is a claim, you would want to have insurance in place, just like we have car insurance in place, but you have insurance in place, and you would say, we just got sued, and you'd contact the insurance agent, and they would assign a lawyer, a litigator, and that person would respond for you. The insurance is used to fund the indemnification. Indemnification is really the promise. It's saying we will, as an organization, we will protect you, the directors and volunteers. So I want to just put this into your kind of vocabulary, this notion of indemnification. It's real important, and I can guarantee you it's really important to directors, and that might be one of the first questions they will ask you. So it only happens, though, if you have the funds to support it. Let's get to the next slide for that reason.
I have a quick question, put in.
Sure.
Is this the same as E&O insurance?
So, I'm sorry, say it again.
Is it the same as E&O insurance, errors and omissions?
That's what we're doing right now. Yes. Yeah, exactly. So there are different labels to it, but there are different types of insurance. There is insurance that's legally required. If you have employees, you have to have unemployment insurance. If you have employees, you have to have workers' comp insurance. That's by law. That's required. This is elective insurance. You don't legally have to have it. I'm telling you, as a practical matter, you probably really want to have it. So let's take a look. So we call it, this is the elective areas of insurance. One is director and officer. It could be called errors and omissions. It's also called sometimes executive protection insurance. That's used to protect the directors against claims that they didn't oversee something properly, or they didn't prevent something properly, or they didn't do something properly. The other is comprehensive general liability, CGL, and that is set up in case someone comes to an event and they slip, they fall, something falls on them, and they get hurt. Added to, and sometimes it goes to one, sometimes the other, we have what are called endorsements, which cover specific types of risks. So if you don't have an employee, you don't have to pay for employee practices liability. You do as soon as you have an employee. Publication coverage, that's what covers defamation, misappropriation. If you have sort of chat rooms or blogs that people can participate in as part of your group, you might have people saying things about others or taking things that belong to others. That's that kind of coverage. So when you're getting your group operational, you want to speak to an insurance agent who understands nonprofits. Make sure they understand nonprofits and talk to them about the risks and your operations. me tell you a quick experience with that. I once had a group contact me. I didn't know them. Contact me to say, can you just check our insurance? Here's what we do. Here's our website. Here's our insurance. So I looked through it, contacted them back. I said, I see your insurance and I see your activities. It looks like you also have a daycare center. They said, right. I said, you don't have insurance for the daycare center. They said, yeah, we know. We just thought that would be too expensive. I said, well, that's your choice, but that's the greatest area of risk based on what you're showing me. So you want to make sure you don't tell a partial story to your insurance agent, or you'll wind up with partial coverage. And you can decide, maybe you can't afford it, but they didn't even tell the agent about that. So an important lesson, make sure you understand the significance of having insurance and what would apply to your group.
Additional question.
Yeah.
If I may, this type of elective insurance, does it cover the indemnification part? Does it cover claims that the bylaws were violated, that litigation that you mentioned earlier?
This is intended to cover, to fund the indemnification of actions, right? But I mean, so we can get a little deeper into what's called tort law, wrongs. There's some insurance that won't cover, or I should put it this way: insurance is not set up to cover intentional acts. So, in other words, you can't say everything is going to be ever covered. If someone on the board attacks someone else, that's an intentional act. So they're not necessarily covered at all, and insurance wouldn't do it. Insurance, covers typically non-volitional things that don't happen intentionally. But yes, understanding that. So it's not everything, but it never would be. Yes, is exactly right. That these types of insurance are intended to cover or fund the indemnification. That's correct.
The case you mentioned earlier, the Virginia case, where the Virginia court had invalidated the board of directors for 10 years. Does your typical insurance policy, pay the cost of litigation under those types of claims?
That's a very tricky, not tricky question. It actually depends how the pleading goes. Sometimes it will, and sometimes it will not. This is an area, if you're not following bylaws, it's an area that sometimes is covered and sometimes is not. I don't know. There wasn't disclosed, to my knowledge, in that case whether whether they had insurance that covered that. It's possible to, but it's possible that some infractions not following your rules will not.
Thank you.
Okay, good. Thank you. So let's go on to sort of this last part of this section, ongoing compliance. So you want to make sure you keep clear financial records, make the required reports to the state, make the required Form 990 reports. And the 990s are three different versions depending on how much income you have and what forms you use. They become more demanding the more income that you have, essentially. So you have 990s, then you have 990 EZs, and you finally have 990 Ns. The break point is if you have more than $200,000, you're filing a full 990, less a 990 EZ, and under 50,000, a 990 N. So I really just want you to get the concepts. Those could even change. That's been the threshold for each, but you have to file some Form 990. If you don't, and this goes back, Charity, to one of your important points earlier, if you don't file your the applicable 990 form you're supposed to for 3 years, you will lose your exemption. Okay, you have to file. If you don't file for 3 years, you'll lose your exemption. Okay, these are great questions, and obviously we're interspersing questions, so we'll have more time, I think, afterwards too, depending on your available time. And let's go to part 4, funding the nonprofit. All right, so this gets into a little history of the tax code, which I know when you woke up this morning, you were hoping you would get to do. So a long time ago, nonprofits could generate revenue in any way they wanted and not have it taxed as long as they used it toward their mission. That's called the destination of income test, a long time ago. So theoretically, a nonprofit could have opened a gas station, just like any other group, run the gas station, not pay tax on its income as long as it used the revenue for its mission. Well, there came a time when, and this sort of peaked, when NYU was given what was called a macaroni factory. You know, it was a long time ago because they called it macaroni, not pasta. But it was given a macaroni factory, and NYU operated it. And it took all the revenue and put it toward NYU, put it toward its mission, and didn't pay tax. So because it didn't pay tax, it could sell for less in the marketplace, sell the pasta for less. So who do you think would have objected to that? If you've got a group competing against you and it is able to compete without the cost of paying taxes, I would say if you're a for-profit, that would be seen as a little unfair. Well, for a number of reasons, but including sort of peaking with that, the IRS and Congress came up with a new rule, and it is the rule today, which is if a nonprofit wants to treat its income as untaxed, that income has to come from a source that's related to your activities. I'll just repeat that. If you want to treat income as untaxed, it's a nonprofit, that income has to come from a source that's related to your activities. So a bilingual teaching nonprofit can charge money for that. Colleges and universities charge huge amounts. That's all related income. You can charge for whatever your activities, back to the 1023. Remember I said I'd tie this in. Whatever you've told the IRS on your application, you can charge for that and the revenue that comes from that and not pay tax. But once you start doing things outside of what you've told the IRS, you could possibly have to pay tax on it. And that's called the unrelated business income tax. So before you get into any revenue generating activity, you want to make sure you know whether it's something that's already been approved by the IRS or whether it's something you could get the IRS to approve.
So Peter, does that get into advanced rulings? I mean, you could request, like if you're contemplating getting into something, you could get the IRS to provide an advanced ruling on whether or not that's a fit.
Yes, although advanced rulings are very sophisticated, they're usually for unknown areas of law, where it's something, very specific tests of maybe like the sale of land in different groups and appropriation of private assets, things like that. For just a recognized area of C3 activity, in other words, I like the ones we know, like the soup kitchen, and now you're getting into literacy, teaching people in the family English or how to read. Okay, that's a recognized and known C3 activity, but it's not one of yours. So you add that to what you do by disclosing on your 990. The 990 says, are you engaged in any other activities? You add that, and then the IRS has a certain amount of time to come back and object to it. But if it's within what's understood already to be an exempt purpose, then you've protected yourself by disclosing it to the IRS. So you want to avoid, obviously, having to pay tax. That's one of the best benefits of being tax exempt on the activities that you conduct. So I wanted you to get this into your sort of nomenclature: unrelated business income tax. It's called UBIT, and it taxes any trade or business that's regularly carried on that's not related to the mission. All right. Other questions about that? or let's go to this, sponsorships. We love sponsorships. We love it. Corporations give money to, and businesses give money to nonprofits. You've probably all seen like the Fun Run t-shirts. On the back of a t-shirt, it lists a million different businesses. You know, McDonald's is supporting us and all listed. That is acknowledgement of a sponsorship. That's great. And you're allowed to say, thank you, really appreciate it, if it's a sponsorship. However, if you start saying terms of promotion, you change a sponsorship into advertising. So this is a little bit sophisticated. We're at a deeper level here. But if you were to say, oh, you know, get this support from the local McDonald's, and you were to say, McDonald's is our favorite place to eat. Go eat there today. Please support them. Then you've essentially changed the sponsorship amount into advertising. All you're allowed to say is, thank you. This is, you know, McDonald's, where it's located. Really appreciate it. Dedicated supporter, platinum sponsor, all those things that show your gratitude and the importance, but you can't say, engage in what's called a call to action, go patronize them, or any qualitative. That's the best food on the planet kind of thing. That is what's called a substantial return benefit, and you can't do that. Insubstantial benefit. And all I want you to know about this, the numbers are there, but essentially, if you've ever donated to a group and they send you like a coffee mug to thank you, or a fleece blanket to thank you, or something like that, you're getting an insubstantial benefit. That's okay. You can do that. So you can, and there's certain thresholds. If you get to the point where people are donating, you always want to check what those thresholds are. They change, but you're allowed to give some value in return when you get when you receive support, if you want to. Certainly calendars, you know, those kinds of things. Okay, let's go ahead. Go ahead, yeah.
So just like public TV, so that's why they call it underwriting, not advertising, and but they can give out those little tchotchkes when you're donating because of what you've said. But
exactly right.
Yeah, they don't have advertisers, but it seems like in recent years they've kind of crossed that line a little. It seems to me they're doing a little more of what feels like advertising.
Yeah,
But,
you know, yeah, they'll say like, you know, thanks to Morgan Stanley, and maybe they'll say their slogan or something, but they're still hopefully pretty careful about not saying, Morgan Stanley, please switch your investment funds there, or please call them today. You know, they'll get into sort of the whole generosity thing, and, you know, maybe Morgan Stanley, known as the leading voice or something, you know, in invest, whatever, they can parrot their own their own slogan to identify them.
And is it typically a for-profit that complains about this and brings attention to the issue if there's a violation?
Yeah, or even believe it or not, a competing nonprofit.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like, oh, you know, this nonprofit will help us more than the other one, because this one's going to tell everybody to go buy our products. So we're just going to support this one. Yeah. So no, it could be either. Anybody who has a stake in it, positively or negatively. That's a good question. Yeah. Yeah. So we'll conclude with this last point, which is, I want this on your radar, and this is fundraising registration. This is not widely known, but it's real important. So it's a practice tip. You have to be aware that 42 states, including Pennsylvania, require nonprofits to register before soliciting contributions. I've given you a website to look at. Check this initially. It doesn't always have the absolute current stuff, but it will lead you to those. And it actually will show a map as to which states require and how you fulfill it. And there are different thresholds. If you have a certain amount you're not meeting, whether you have to file and what you have to file. But I want you to know that, because you can be identified by the state, and your organization could be fined, or I mean, theoretically could be banned from fundraising. It's very rare. But if you're not complying with these registration obligations.
I do have a question about the sponsorship, if I may.
Yeah.
Okay, in regards to the insubstantial benefit of $74, is that per year or per incident? Like, say maybe someone like,
Yeah, that's per year.
okay,
Yeah, some people will give like every month, and and that would obviously be a very, very high amount, 2%, 74 being 2%. So why don't we pause for a minute? The questions have been good and timely, and so I appreciate being able to clarify on all the points you've raised. Laura, we sort of put together two different things, I think, both what I wanted to mention and explain, and also the questions. So obviously it's taken us into both, sessions. So pause for a minute. And anybody have other questions you wanted to raise?
we have two questions that we have. The EIN prior to incorporating, does that carry over after we've incorporated, or do we file for a new one?
I'm sorry, that didn't come through clearly to me. Can you ask again, please?
Sure. We had an EIN prior to incorporating. Will that carry over now that we're incorporated, or do we need to file for a new EIN?
She's asking if
Yes,
the EIN
got it.
carries over.
Got it that time. Thank you. Yeah. So technically it is a new entity. It is a successor. How long has it been operating?
We're the parent-teacher organization, so it's been in operation for a long time, but we just incorporated this summer.
Yeah. So technically, yeah, a corporation is going to be a new entity, but you can identify it as a successor if that's what you intend to do.
So we can continue to use that EIN.
No, you get a new EIN. It's a new entity.
And file for the new.
Yeah.
And then with the 1020 or 1023 EZ, is that based on revenue or the deposits that come through our account? Because we do, for example, we do the holiday shop at Christmas time. We have very little markup on that, but we may have $15,000 come through our account. So we were kind of under the impression that we had to do the extended version because we would have over $50,000 come through the account, but very little of that would be income because a lot of that would go to the vendor.
Right. Yeah. So that's correct. It is the annual gross receipts is the measure of that 50,000. That's correct. It's not net. It's not based on how much you get to retain.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Anything else for Peter? Well, Peter, we're sorry you can't join us for lunch later, but we'll be sending you a treat from Fayette County in appreciation of your sharing all this.
Okay, thanks. I look forward to that, and I'll do a rain check on lunch sometime and get up there, I hope.
Thank you for sharing your expertise with us this morning.
Yeah,
You're
let's
welcome.
give Peter a hand.
I hope the rest of the day, thank you. I hope the rest of the day is also productive for you all. Good.
Thank you so much.
The information in this program is provided as a service to our local community by the Fayette County Public Relations Initiative.